welcome back inside our New York City studios here on a Thursday, October 26, 2017. This is the MMA Beat. I hope everyone is doing well. As you can see next to me, I have a series of incompetent idiots. No, I'm teasing. We were supposed to have, and I include myself as one of the incompetent idiots, just to be perfectly clear. I'm sure the audience was very confused. We were supposed to have Ariel today, but I found out late last night, you're not going to believe this, he actually got a invite. He was selected as the world's biggest Washington Nationals fan. Wow. He's in D.C., he's meeting Bryce, and he's having the time of his life as the world's biggest Washington Nationals fan.
Push it down a little further.
We had a bit of a scheduling issue, so he can't be here today. He will be here next week, and we will, by the way, have an MMA Beat next week. We'll talk about that at the end of the show, even though it's going to be UFC 217. I am Luke Thomas from SiriusXM, as well as MMA Fighting. That is Jeff Wagenheim from the Washington Post, man in the shirt, man in the hat. You know him from The Ringer, as well as MMA Fighting. Chuck Mindenhall, and at the end, the world's most average Colombian, Danny Segura.
Wow, you got this.
Thank you.
Flying fast and heavy, man.
I'm in a feisty mood. I'm kidding.
10 minutes into this thing.
That's a terrible insult. I'm so sorry about that, Danny. It just came from nowhere. Danny Segura from MMAfighting.com as well. Okay, boys, you know I'm just teasing. Let's get right down to it. So, I've been thinking about this all week. I've been talking about it in various places all week, including on MMA Fighting on my live chat yesterday. But the big thing that sort of occurred to me was Joe Rogan actually made a little bit of news. And he sprinkled out there during his UFC, is it Gdansk or Dansk? I can never pronounce this Polish city correctly. His Fight Companion podcast with Brendan Schaub, and I believe Eddie Bravo was on it as well. And he had indicated that he had heard that St-Pierre versus Bisping was not selling all that well. This is true. At least, pay-per-views always come in late, but in terms of like ticket sales and things like that, it had come in not all that great. You'll note that there wasn't a lot of announced media coverage for things that were media. The UFC did a survey of pay-per-view buying audiences back in 2016 when it was believed that GSP was going to make his comeback. And in that, it was determined, or at least discovered, that the survey showed current UFC pay-per-view customers did not either know who GSP was or did not necessarily respect his celebrity. And that was shocking to them. I know for a fact on this show, I scoffed at that idea and found it ridiculous. Boy, that aged well.
Right.
It turned out to be quite true. Now, I don't want to get into the prediction business because I actually think in the end, for a very different reason, 217 might actually do just fine, which undercuts this a little bit. But Jeff, I'll start with you. It appears to have been true. So my question is, not even a question really. The executives had a point. They were kind of right. They did their due diligence. There was something to that. What does it mean?
Well, it means that over the course of 4 years, the last time GSP was in the octagon was 2013. A 4-year period is a long time to for a turnover of a fan base. I mean, just think about it. I mean, you know, my son is 14. He watches fights now. 4 years ago, he was 10. He didn't really care. I mean, add up people in their 20s who maybe were in college 4 years ago and weren't really paying attention to this stuff.
I was paying attention.
And then all of a sudden, look, the UFC has 11 champions, right? How many of those champions do you think were the champion when GSP last fought?
Ooh, one? None?
Yes.
One. DJ, right?
Demetrius Johnson, that's it. The heavyweight champion at the time, the last time GSP fought, Cain Velasquez. I mean, just think about you could roll through all these weight classes. I believe Anthony Pettis was the lightweight champion at that time. I mean, these are guys who they're not ancient history, but to some extent they are, because if you've got a fan base, particularly, we talk about how Conor McGregor has widened this fan base. Well, before he came along, the fighters who were stars before then, they maybe, don't have quite that much glimmer. So, yeah, this is the natural course of things.
Chuck, it's a turnover issue?
Partially. I mean, it is a lot to unpack because, honestly, when you go back to look at GSP's career, it's been 4 years since he fought, but it's almost 9 years since he finished somebody. You'd have to go back, and that's UFC 94.
I didn't think about that, actually.
That's UFC 94. Now, it's not just that he's been...
BJ Penn
exactly, and that wasn't an emphatic thing. It was just he couldn't answer the bell. But it's one of those situations where you look at maybe taste changing too in that realm. So you're saying they don't respect, maybe what his legacy is. It's a weird thing to have to contemplate. GSP, when he came along, the biggest thing that he was transcendent is he basically was the consummate professional who rose the sport to some kind of like attainable degree for a common person to look at and be like, hey, these guys are pretty sane. This isn't like the inmates, fighting between sentences. These are guys that are normal guys. GSP was the perfect guy for professionalism to bring it to a certain area. Where he dropped the sport off and where it went to where, to right now, completely different. I mean, if you look at the people who've emerged, you wonder, what does the fight game really want out of its stars? I don't think they really want a GSP, a goody two-shoes. I think you're looking at people, and I saw Elliot Warsaw had mentioned something about this, a writer, Elliot Warsaw. He mentioned the people who kind of emerged as stars were kind of a hero/anti-hero. They were both. They were both things. They represented a bigger population of people. They drew bigger eyes. They became, there was just the polarizing things that they were able to pull off in that time. They had more charisma. It just feeds this. It feeds the beast, if you could say, over the last few years. So you got Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey, John Jones. Every single one of them you could praise, and every single one of them you could be like, yeah, but that, you could find plenty to talk negative about. I think they're the perfect blend of what a star looks like right now, and it developed through that period. So it's, in some ways it is. In some ways it's like 4 years is a long time. People who knew GSP knew a specific kind of thing, like that we were looking for at the time. We wanted this guy to kind of rise the sport. He did. UFC 129, kind of getting this, it was, remember how big that was? Because it was like he was the guy pushing it through. Well, it went through, and then these people emerged. Therefore, GSP's kind of an older, he's part of an old guard. The professional idealism and stuff like that, I'm not sure that's what people want anymore. And I think that that's at least part of it. Like you said, there's so much to unpack on that, but I think in the 4 years, it's really the perception in this evolving sport has changed to that degree.
Yeah. Danny, do you agree?
Yeah, I think, not only has what the stars today, what they look like and what they represent have changed, but also the fan base has changed. If you look at the fan base that was tuning in when GSP was around and he was a dominant champion, the UFC was very different back then, and that was a fan base that would tune in for a different reason, perhaps martial arts purpose. Now, Conor McGregor, again, 7 minutes in, we're already talking about Conor McGregor.
Doesn't take long anymore, does it?
Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey, John Jones, they all brought this new wave of fans that have really just been tuning into MMA for maybe 3 years or so,
But John was champion when GSP was champion, right?
Sure, but, mainly I would say Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey really did bring, a huge audience that are now all of a sudden, into MMA and want to buy the pay-per-views and watch. And that audience is definitely disconnected with the past. I can just speak, personally, I was way too little to watch Fedor fight. And to be honest, I don't ever consider him in my pound for pound rankings because there's a disconnection there.
That's a revelation. That's interesting.
But I'm sure you guys watched him fight live, accomplish many great things. And, I can look up his Wikipedia page and I know
I was actually at his birth.
Yes, I'm sure, yeah. And I'm sure, I know he had great accolades, defeated many great fighters, but there's just a huge disconnect there. And to me, Fedor doesn't mean as much as it might mean to other people.
Let me pitch it right back to you, because I brought this up and I had a variety of interesting responses from readers about it. I didn't quite know what to make of it. I thought some had some good points. So let me see what you guys have to say about this. We're talking about this incredible turnover. And we're talking about, if you are here 1 minute and you don't come back pretty soon, you're missing out on that, not only a narrow opportunity for your own physical abilities, but the fans who are here won't be the same ones at the end of your career. That seems like an incredible amount of turnover that is frankly kind of scary. However, what about Kimbo Slice? Kimbo Slice took 5 years off of MMA. Now, he was boxing, but can you name anybody he boxed? And the only real news he had made was that he eked by a guy in Australia and he may have thrown a fight here, or the guy may have thrown a fight with him here in some Indian reservation or Native American reservation. It wasn't like he was out there on SportsCenter or anything. He comes back and he does record ratings. Now, a couple of differences. He wasn't asked to sell pay-per-view, and maybe he would have bombed if that had been the case. It's something to consider. However, the interesting part about Kimbo Slice, I never realized he's very different from GSP, but that's the point. Everyone was arguing, Danny, that, and I made this point, and I think it's still true, passions for Kimbo Slice, they died hard, man. They lasted a very long time. Why isn't that the same way for St-Pierre?
It just comes down to, I think, one personality look. Like, Kimbo Slice has this very unique look. And he also made his fame in YouTube. I mean, even when
St-Pierre had a unique look, too. I mean, yes,
sure.
In some ways, he was a bit of a...
I'm sure, people are not looking up, yo, let me see Nick Diaz, GSP on YouTube and, all these other fights. But with Kimbo Slice, you're always down to watch some backyard brawl in Miami.
This is your Miami bias shining through.
So, Kimbo Slice, he sort of became part of, American culture in a way. Like people knew who this street fighter was.
So you believe he was bigger than MMA? He just got funneled into MMA rather than GSP was not bigger than MMA but came through MMA. Is
For
that
sure.
would you agree with that characterization? Like, why is Kimbo's appeal so enduring?
I mean, it'd be like if you were looking at, Dennis Rodman versus some equal player, equal type of stats, maybe lesser stats, but they're just a PC kind of person. They're very consummate professional. They know how to treat a camera and all this stuff. It's that kind of thing. You're going to be more compelled to watch Dennis Rodman because he's a little bit more of a live wire. He's a little bit more unpredictable and those types of things. I think that the YouTube, it's really first impressions. You're watching somebody like Kimbo Slice, where he came out of. There was massive, massive appeal to see what he could do. This was also during the boom period. When we started, when bigger eyes, more eyes were on the sport, more eyes were finding the way of the sport. GSP was a part of that, but he's been big. I mean, it's not like we're sitting here saying that he was not big. I just think he represents sort of that boom period from a different perspective. I think he was the professional guy that people loved because he was lovable. He was like the guy who you looked at, you're like, oh, this is the guy, that's going to, discipline, all the things that we used to talk about, like discipline and traditionalism and all this stuff. He was that guy, right? He was kind of giving you all of that stuff you got with GSP. As they take the tape away.
It's a production staff. Sorry.
But, so I think that it goes back to the psychology of what we want in the fight game. And I think some things will hold because they remain compelling, and some things may start to fall, like almost like, they start to kind of lose they have an expiration date or something along those lines. Also,
it may just come down to the simple fact that when Kimbo Slice fought you, he did not go out, take you down, and dominate you for 5 rounds. Now, those of us who enjoy a good fight and either understand or at least appreciate the technicalities involved in how an athlete performs in the octagon, we can appreciate GSP. But for the masses, for most people, it's so much easier to just say, well, this guy's going to go out there and he's going to knock that guy out. And that's why Kimbo Slice was such a phenomenon. That's why give us a couple years if Rumble Johnson decides to come out of retirement. And, think about why people still want to watch Mark Hunt. I mean, there are certain athletes who I realize those guys are not as big as Kimbo, but there's an appeal to those guys who just throw the big bungalows and want to knock you out. There's an enduring appeal because you want to see can that guy do it.
People weren't.
The one thing I'm just having a little trouble squaring is the notion that there's heavy turnover, and yet Kimbo is immune from it. How is he immune from it if there's heavy turnover?
Because you see some highlights and all you see is this dude, and even if you don't necessarily know who he is, you probably do because he did reach over into the mainstream. So let's say you were not a big MMA fan, but you had heard a few names. You'd heard of some of these people. Kimbo was probably one of the names you heard of, even if you didn't quite know who he was. Then you watch a highlight, all you're seeing is knockout, knockout, knockout. And you're like, okay, I'll watch that guy. Whereas if you're watching GSP, maybe you heard that name also, but you don't get that payoff.
I don't know about the turnover, but the way that GSP left the sport was both auspicious and inauspicious. Like, he left it, and I think a lot of people were like, yes, this is great. A guy going out on top, essentially, right? But there was a lot of people, Dana White, obviously, in that last press conference, you remember, was just kind of threw him under the bus after that when his face was all busted up, and here he is having to
He
deal with
owes this company.
Exactly. So it was like he left on the right foot, but it's also a weird foot in terms of perception, like people who just follow the UFC. He's also been associated with so many things within that flux that's happened. He was part of the association, one of the big mouthpieces and faces of the association that formed. He's been a leader in the PED, cracking down on the PEDs. He's been outspoken on things that I think, or kind of the righteous side of how to make the sport better. But again, it's an association to negativity. It's an association to politics within the game. And sometimes that stuff will wear on you too. I don't know if it's just that there's this big turnover of people. I think that there's just some fatigue with GSP, which is crazy to think he can be gone for 4 years and then come back with that state of things.
And I also think the fan base we're talking about, he might not be very popular there, but I do really think there's an audience out there that perhaps is not so tuned into MMA, but that was at one point when GSP was around. Perfect example is my brother. He used to watch, Frankie Edgar come up the rankings, defeat.
Is your brother
BJ
older
Penn.
or younger?
Older.
Okay.
He's 31. And he used to be super into MMA until then there was a fight card every single weekend and he just couldn't keep up. And then all of a sudden it's like, who's Max Holloway? Who are these guys? But he knows who GSP is. So I'm sure if he knows he's fighting, he'll buy that pay-per-view. He might not be part of that focus group because he's not, included in that new fan base, but he certainly will go out of his way to watch someone he knows, especially paired up with an old dog like, Michael Bisping as well, an OG of the game.
Sure.
I think those two will actually reach the older audience.
So this is the issue here. People are like, well, how do you know it won't sell well? I don't know that it won't sell well. It actually might. I'm just sort of bringing up this discussion because, one, there was this truth value to the fact that MSG was not selling well. MMA Junkie's Mike Bond at yesterday's TriStar Media Day had asked him about this very fact, and St-Pierre didn't even deny it. So there's a certain acceptance from St-Pierre even that this might be true. However, I think you bring up a great point, Danny, which is I don't know in the end it will do poorly, and this is why I say that. I don't think it's going to do gangbusters, although I suppose I can't rule that out either. But my thought is I had this, I won't say the exact same feeling prior to UFC 214 at this space away from it, so 10 days or something?
Right, yeah.
And then the fight week, I remember it got a little warmer, and got a little warmer, and got a little warmer. And so by the time Saturday came around, you were like, wow, okay, this thing really kind of picked up at the very, very end. In other words, St-Pierre might not show up on focus groups, as you point out. There might be an audience that knows him that needs a little massaging, needs a little resuscitation in the end. But here's the thing. Number one, that might be true, but that's a gamble, right?
It is a gamble.
And number two, this is the thing I don't get. The UFC, before anybody else, knew that there was a, what do you want to call it, visibility gap with GSP that had to be overcome, which is why they probably play hardball with him. If you knew that, Jeff, why didn't you promote harder? Why didn't you? Why are you doing these events after the fact? And people say, what could they do differently? The UFC's YouTube channel is incredible. Not one St-Pierre fight was on there when I checked this morning, and certainly nothing even close to the top. It's all like old post-fight interviews and stuff. None of that stuff is out there. No one's telling the story that St-Pierre, he's on the cusp of doing something amazing. And by the way, if Michael Bisping wins, there's craziness to it. How come the UFC wasn't more proactive when they knew this?
That's the question.
You've said it all with that.
Yeah, really. That's the question. Look, I think that they right from the get-go, this
What
fight
does that say about the UFC that they were not
right
proactive?
from the get-go, this fight has been promoted in an odd way. I mean, remember when they had a press conference without even saying when they were, without even apparently having the contract signed, or even like having a date for it. They just said, we're going to have these two guys fight. And so there's so many little reasons to downgrade the fight in buyers' minds. I mean, GSP, yeah, great champion of the past, but hasn't fought in 4 years, and as Chuck pointed out, hadn't finished somebody in how many years? Like 9 years?
9, almost 9.
And then you look at the fight itself. Well, GSP never even fought in this weight class, and yet he's challenging for the championship. And then Bisping, well, this is another Bisping, title defense, non-defense in a sense, because he has yet to face the number one guy in his weight class. He got his revenge fight against Dan Henderson, then he gets this. I mean, come on, when's he going to actually defend against one of the top middleweight? So you can look at all those things and say, these are all reasons to kind of think less of the fight. Yeah, I think it's going to be an entertaining fight. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing it, and certainly the two other title fights on the card have a lot of interest from me. But it's always, we've seen again and again that it's always the main event. That's the one that sells pay-per-views, not the other fights. And there's a lot of reasons to kind of question this one.
They used to control the narrative so well. Like UFC, it became a something to criticize at some point when they controlled the narrative in ways that were not real. But this is one of those simple situations. You have a guy who has fought a who's who for so long and held that championship for so long, that welterweight championship, never lost it. It's the story's inherent. You could run that story and build the hype around that so well.
You could even tell the story about this. Did people forget about GSP?
Exactly.
Are you one of those? Just have a moment of reflection, like they did. The authenticity of the Jones promo. Remember that when we saw it? I was like, wow, the UFC really kept.
You could
do that again here.
That was a home run. And that's why I say that's why it's a little surprising. Honestly, it's a little surprising that they haven't tried to rev up the old engine, you know, like here it is, like this is why. Did you forget what this guy did, who he was, and just kind of go back and show. I mean, because honestly, if you really think about GSP's career, a lot of it, you know, toward the end there, he had some fights where he got nicked up a little bit and he didn't look as great, but he still got the job done. But if you go back further, man, in that
the Jay Huron wins,
oh my God, if you go back to those, I mean, it's gold. It will never get old.
The second Matt Hughes fight.
Yeah.
I mean,
hold on, let me pitch something to Danny, if I may, because I thought you raised something, and you raised something as well that really deserves, I think, a little more inspection. You mentioned Conor McGregor. You just can't have a conversation in MMA today without some relevance to the point, namely this. Maybe the audience has had some turnover, maybe they haven't. Maybe these old people can be resuscitated as fans, maybe they can't, at least for this one night on November 4th. What I think is kind of interesting is, you mentioned GSP, the real value he served was as this sort of not a vanguard, but like this, you know, he's our apex example of truth and professionalism in the martial arts way. And at the time, the UFC was seeking to be a part of the larger sports establishment. Once you get that, you lose what value do you really serve anymore? You got us to the next stage. That was what your purpose was. Okay, Danny, but here's my question. If that might be true, in fact, I think it's a really good point. But what does that say? Has fan preference changed to the point where now achievement, it's not that it's irrelevant, but that it's really insufficient as a means of keeping the current UFC pay-per-view buying audience's attention? What they need is your achievement and then a little bit extra. Is that the case now?
Look at Demetrius Johnson. He's one of the best fighters in the world, just broke the record, and, you know, what headlines is he making? I mean, is he a big pay-per-view draw? But then
we'll actually get to that later in the show, but
you get Conor McGregor, you know, doing whatever, just talking smack, and, you know, he'll sell. So
saying a bad word.
Yeah.
Has McGregor transformed UFC audience preference?
Yeah, I think so. He's changed the game, not only in the way, you know, fighters are now expressing themselves or carrying their careers or the way they approach the UFC, but also fan preference. You know, if you look at, for example, press conference, like, people are tuning into these interviews. People are tuning in. They just want to see Conor McGregor talk smack. You know, we saw, obviously, Bisping try to do the same with George, but George is not really biting, although, you know, he's throwing a few
those
shots.
Those shoving matches between those two, it's like, fellas, you were on Skype calls last week.
So I do think,
stop it.
I do think fan preference has changed, but that's not an excuse for this fight not to sell. I mean, Georges St-Pierre is the greatest welterweight of all time. I mean, that itself just sells. And just the fact that he's going up a weight class and taking on the champion, a guy who's, you know, well established in the UFC and the MMA world, Michael Bisping. You know, we were just talking about, you know, what is going on, like, what's wrong with the UFC not being able to promote it. One, we know they're a bit understaffed as far as, you know, marketing goes. And two, you know I sound like a broken record, but how many events do we have? I mean, it's hard to promote event after event after event. I mean, I was just looking at the YouTube channel. You know, I post some of the free fights on MMAfighting.com, and they don't even have a single one up for, you know, this card in Sao Paulo. That's just a few days away.
They have no Lyoto fights?
No, zero. They don't have any fights whatsoever, and they have like a small preview. It's just difficult because, like, you just wrapped up with Darren Till. You want to make him into a big star, but now you got to promote a different event.
And it's not just with the frequency of events and everything else, audacity and seizing the moment and those things start to matter more so maybe than accomplishment. And I think we saw a little bit even in the Darren Till fight. Who does he call out? He calls out Mike Perry, who's forming this queue, and Mike Perry on cue jumps up and starts getting on him. Everybody's talking about Mike Perry. Yeah. I mean, to me, that's what people are paying attention to. You're talking about this shift in perception and maybe what people want. That seems to be it. I think sometimes those people who just know how to put themselves into every circumstance and start to do it this, you know, shout louder and, you know, seize moments better. I mean, those are the guys that.
I mean, but we are 9 days out. Let's not forget, we're 9 days out, and there's a lot of time to ramp up. You know, it may be that they've consciously tamped things down until, you know, Sunday morning. After these Brazil fights are done, they hit us hard with that stuff. And there's enough time to tell that GSP story and to have those people who might have forgotten that he's on this card, remind them to
and I also just want to bring this up. I know we talk about, like, you know, has fan preference changed, but I also feel like the way UFC markets fights has changed as well. Before, they used to control the narrative and tell you what was what, right? With this whole Conor McGregor era, they kind of just, put it on cruise control and let Conor McGregor steer the ship.
It
And
drives me
if
crazy.
you look at what sells,
with the exception of UFC 214 when they told the story
Right.
with that excellent promo.
but that was sort of a little detour there. But if you look at what makes headlines, it's not the UFC making the narrative. It's the fighters. For example, we talk about Mike Perry going at it with Darren Till. It wasn't the UFC saying, oh, these two guys are great. They're exciting. They could possibly fight. No, it was Darren Till looking at Mike Perry across the cage and be like, I want to fight you. And then Perry hopping on the cage and yelling at him.
But the UFC had to get him there.
Of course, yeah, the UFC had to get him there, but they're not bringing this guy in. I mean, a lot of it is what the fighters, can do, and GSP's not doing much, and the UFC has sort of gotten accustomed to, we'll let you promote the event,
Which I think is a tragic mistake. It's not that they can't do it. I mean, a guy like McGregor obviously can do it better than anybody else can.
Sure.
But my point is, generally speaking, I think farming out matchmaking and narrative telling responsibilities to fighters on balance is a bad idea. That's just my perception of things. Okay, one last note about this, and we got to move on before everyone wants to kill me. Well, a bit late for that, I suppose. When St-Pierre fought Hardy, now it was not at Madison Square Garden, so you have to kind of play with that a little bit. It was at the Prudential Center, which is just over the bridge into lice-infested Newark. I can say that because I work there. What a terrible place that is. I meant New Jersey. Sorry. Anyway, at the Prudential Center,
We'll get him started.
it's $4 million was the gate, $770,000 was the pay-per-view buy rate. Now they promoted that heavily with those primetime shows on Spike and the whole nine, and they put out everything. Joe Rogan's wearing a tap-out shirt with his hat on backwards. It's a show. But let's see what this does relative to that, both at the gate and on pay-per-view. All right, with that out of the way, you mentioned Darren Till, so let's get to Darren Till. Wow. Show of hands, who watched that fight live? Wow.
I went
Shame
back
on
and
you,
watched it.
Chuck.
You, Benedict Arnold. All right, then we'll start with you, hater. The Darren Till hater over here, Chuck Mindenhall. Darren Till, what
What is
an
live? Hey, I don't like things live.
what an incredible performance by him. This guy, if you go back and look at his record, I was looking at his record talking about this before, and I was like, that's interesting. He didn't really finish anybody, has these strong rounds, and then he looks pretty good, but, and then you could just see, sometimes these guys are like, I'm the best so-and-so in the world. You're like, man, it's like, come on, please. But there was something like when Conor McGregor says it, you're like, I don't know, maybe he's onto something. I feel the same spidey tingle with Darren Till, right?
Yeah.
Dude, is he the next big thing at welterweight, which, by the way, is an incredible division right now?
So the thing with Conor McGregor, and I know we're sitting there talking about him again, but when he was coming up, he had the presence of mind to talk like this, but it was really just rising to each spotlight. He met each spotlight and he was bigger than the event. That's really what he did. So each time the spotlight got bigger, he would shine brighter. Just that's how it was. This was his moment. So this was Darren Till coming into this fight, and it was a big step up in competition. I don't know how many people have been paying attention. I know we pay attention to it, but I don't know how many people outside had seen him fight a couple of these guys in the UFC, and where he was at. Everybody, the people who've been paying attention know he has some charisma. He's definitely one of those guys you've earmarked me, like, watch out for this guy because he could do something. So he gets this fight with Donald Cerrone. And I felt like this could be it just from the gate of saying, like, just from the jump, because you realize that Donald Cerrone being the name, you knew that this kid could meet the spotlight of doing that. He gets his own main event and all this stuff. And I thought that that's what makes it, well, you were mentioning the spidey sense. You watch the way he handled himself during fight week, how he looked in the cage, and then how he handled himself outside afterward. And you think, okay, this is the makings of a star, because he can back it up in there. He can back it up in the cage. He says the things. He plants the things. He's like, I'm a light heavyweight fighting in this division. He's making himself seem Herculean against these guys. And he is. He's a huge hulking figure in the cage. To me, he's doing it exactly right. He's planting exactly how he wants him to be perceived, and he's meeting each spotlight, as bright as the spotlight will get. That seems to be how he wants to grow into it.
Yeah, I mean, what a star. And let's just talk about the fight for a second. Donald Cerrone has, sort of created a career of, a great fighter can get through anyone, but when he gets to either a title contender or a title, he tends to not do so well. But other than that, any other fight you put him in, he'll win. Well, this wasn't a super high-profile fight. This wasn't, a title contender or anything like that. So Darren Till was kind of the guy that broke that. It sort of felt like, he was this guy that, came in and beat Donald Cerrone, and not many people have been able to do that when it's, not in that scenario. So that itself is just a huge achievement, and just the way he carried himself after the post-fight conference. And yeah, when he says things like, I'm the best fighter ever, I'm the best welterweight, there is a thing to it. It's not just someone saying it, and you're just running their mouth. It feels like, okay, this guy knows something that I don't know. And that's what it feels like with Conor McGregor. Obviously, we don't know if he'll reach that level of stardom, but, he is from Liverpool, the UK. We know Michael Bisping's been big for the UK, and he's sort of reaching,
But here's the difference with that, Jeff. Michael Bisping definitely was at Wolfslayer for a long time, but eventually really turned a corner as a fighter, mostly in the last couple of years, but eventually just resettled in Orange County, California. Having somebody from that place, training in that place, living in that place, the Conor McGregor thing.
Thoroughly. 24 years old, and he embodies
you
it.
look at them and you can hear him talk. Right. Man, you can't fake that accent. That is the real deal Holyfield. And I think that matters when it comes to being a star. It's not that Michael's somehow less authentic as a member of the UK. He is just as much a member. But in terms of just finding a prideful avatar for that kind of thing, Darren Till's got it all, man.
Although Till did relocate to Brazil for a bit of training.
Sure.
But he is back. He is back now, and of course he's the real deal.
That's almost a charming thing because he has a Scouse Brazilian accent. It's like the craziest thing on earth. But go ahead.
No, but I agree with you. There is something about not being an expat, but being a guy who's actually from that spot. I mean, I think we've heard a couple of, who was it now? One of the Brazilian fighters was getting some grief from one of his countrymen about.
The ones who come to the States.
Gadara was getting criticized.
Yeah. That kind of thing. But look, Till, I think is, he's done everything he needs to do. I'm not sure that the Mike Perry call out was the right thing. I think he actually when he went on Twitter and kind of refocused his attention more on Wonder Boy. I think that, and then someone asked him, well, what if Masvidal, I like to fight him. I think that he needs to target. He doesn't need to target Perry, who is a guy below him right now. I mean, he was probably above him before, and once you beat Donald Cerrone, you leap up, and even in the crazy UFC rankings that I know are not too meaningful, even those, he's in the rankings, and Perry is, I don't even know where he is. But having established yourself there, now you got to look upward. You got to look for the next mountain to climb. And I don't know whether it means, I know that we got Wonder Boy and Masvidal fighting each other, so I don't know whether this guy has earned a shot at the winner, or if the winner of that fight's going to go for a title. Maybe he fights the loser of that fight. But either of those guys has the kind of name that he can further build himself on.
That's like old school meritocracy stuff.
This is the way I look. Yeah,
I know what you're saying. For sure, that should be the case. But in some ways, I'm like, Mike Perry, if they put that fight together, I know Mike Perry has a fight coming up. But you almost think of that and you think, wow. That's like, it's just because of how they're presenting themselves, that becomes an intrigue fight.
But do you think that, let's say that you set up now, in one reality, Till versus Wonder Boy. Another reality, Till versus Perry, and then he wins both of those fights. Which one of those is going to propel him farther? I would think the Wonder Boy.
In this new day and age, I don't know.
I would think the beating Wonder Boy would be
which one.
It could be Wonder Boy.
I just don't know if there's like a literal rankings anymore.
I would say, something that I've noticed stands out, good fighters from great fighters, especially that are successful, have successful careers, is not just looking ahead, but looking 2-3 steps ahead. I mean, Till's planting seeds. What if Perry goes on and destroys Ponzinibbio, and then all of a sudden he's in the rankings, all of a sudden he's talking about he goes on and win another fight, then Till goes on to beat Wonder Boy, and then all of a sudden you got history. You can play a clip from, I don't know, say 2 years from now of that, or a year from now, and you got a case to make a really solid fight, a rivalry. That's what Conor McGregor does.
During
he plants
his seeds. ACL recovery, he just basically went on Twitter and blew up everybody in the division.
Yeah.
He just set himself up for everybody.
Look at the little run-in he had at the weigh-ins with Tyron Woodley. I mean, there's no way he was going to fight Tyron Woodley anytime soon, but he's just planting the seed. If that fight ever happens, we have footage of them, staring each other down and sizing each other up, at weighing. So I think Darren Till's playing it completely.
It's amazing. We look at Conor McGregor and we say, well, it's an amazing formula what he has and how he's propelled himself. How easily can somebody else replicate something like this? And the answer is not very easily. Right. However, Conor McGregor light or some Conor McGregor inspiration taken to your own realm, like Darren Till is doing. Even Darren Till kind of stands a little bit, that European style a little bit.
Yeah.
That actually might be replicable at scale.
Conor was authentic, right? The reason he's able to do is because he was authentic.
But my point is, I don't think you either need or can match what he does.
Yeah.
But if you can take a little bit, that is rocket fuel.
100%. I was trying to say that Darren Till is basically, what's translating is his authenticity. Like, you see him and you think, like, okay, this guy is who he is. And I feel like if they're naturally able to absorb a bigger spotlight and handle pressure in certain ways, yeah, I mean, the sky's the limit. I mean, I feel like that's what Conor McGregor had. He just kept rising in the moon. I feel like Darren Till has a little bit of that. Whether you want to look at that as like, it's McGregor-esque or just it's Till-esque in terms of like, or any star that has that kind of thing. I feel like he's got a little bit of that. You know?
You got to be able to handle that spotlight. I mean, you have to, if you talk the talk, you have to be able to go out there and fight and win. You got to do that. On the other hand, if you go out and fight and win, but then the microphone is put in front of you and you just, you kind of choke then you haven't completed the job. And that's what you're, I guess, getting at, that there's a lot of components to becoming that megastar. Yeah. And he doesn't necessarily have to hit every single one of those touch points, but he does have to at least get the major ones. He has to win. He has to get in with somebody who's another big step. I mean, Donald Cerrone, that was a brilliant thing to get.
But now he's summoned the eyeballs. And now it's time to really
100%.
deliver.
That's what I was going to say. It'll come down to now how he proceeds on this next one. It's just
if it's Wonder Boy or somebody else. By the way, the number of interesting fights at welterweight now are incredible. Yeah. I wanted to see Till versus Usman. Usman has the fight up against Meek, but I still think those two guys, Kamaru Usman is the other X factor at welterweight no one's talking about. But then you've got RDA versus Lawler, Ponzinibbio versus Perry. Right. It's everyone's like, Condit's coming back. Condit's great. He's got some competition. Oh, yeah. It's going to be tough for anybody who's taking some time off. It's actually,
you get nervous for the older guys now because you're like, there's so much young power coming up that you're like, man, look out.
But that brings us to the other side of this equation, which is Donald Cerrone, who looked to be physically in shape for this, not emotionally bothered by it, although perhaps that's part of the problem. But here's where we are now. He went on an incredible run at lightweight, lost to Dos Anjos, jumps up, has a incredible run at welterweight, eventually finds his way to Jorge Masvidal. He gets absolutely brutalized, should not have come out for that second round. I actually asked him about that. He goes, "You're right. I should never have come out for that second round. That was really bad." Then he goes and loses to Lawler, not particularly in a bad way. Right. In fact, you could argue he even won it, but he didn't come out on the right side of things. And then he goes and he gets crushed here. Now, Till might be the next big thing. It's not like he's losing to scrubs. So I'll ask you, Danny, where is Donald Cerrone in his career right now?
I mean, he's 34 years old, I believe.
That's something.
3-fight losing streak now. I mean, he's still, in the rankings.
2 by stoppage, and you could argue that both were by first round KO because that second round against Masvidal was.
But he's versing killers. This is a guy that's all the time just I'll fight anyone, anytime, fighting 6 times a year, a ridiculous amount. But he's 34 now. I would like to see him slow down a little bit. He is towards the end of his career. But I'm not ready to write him off. I do think he still has a lot of fight left in him. I would just like to see him sort of, and I know it's part of his persona just to take, fights anytime, anywhere. I'll step up on a week's notice, but I would like to see him sort of, chill, take a little bit of time off, and build his way back up. Take someone, Till's a killer. He could easily do another fun fight, but it doesn't have to be a top 5 guy. It doesn't have to be another killer.
The amount of mental weight this game has on so many people, you see it, just to stay on top is so exhausting. This is a guy who's been doing it for so long, so casually almost. Going back to 2011 when he had the 5 fights, then he's had I think the last 3 years going into this year, he's had 4 each year. He's not all of them are killers, but this year when you look at that slate, who he's fought in 2017, you're like, who goes through that? Who goes through that? And it's only October. I agree with you. I just think it's one of those situations you're like, man, this guy's been doing it for a long time. He's maintained somehow his mental health in a way that's I think very unique to him. And his physical health, very unique to him. I don't know if it's the Greg Jackson, I don't know if it's just his mentality, but he's handled himself so brilliantly through his career of just bringing it down a notch, basically, so that he feels like anything is acceptable. And It's crazy that he's in this position in some ways, because you're like, I never thought he would lose. He's so natural the way he fights it. I never really would. I thought he would never lose 3 fights in a row, to be honest.
Yeah,
He's just that.
Keep in mind, he won 4 fights in 2016.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not like this is some like long decline.
And these are monsters. The guys he just went through. You're like,
but he has that thing about having a slow start. I mean, it's not every single fight, but he's done it on multiple occasions where he gets a slow start. And even in this fight, even though he was getting beaten to the punch right from the get-go, as I'm watching it, I'm thinking, okay, Cowboy just is trying to measure the guy up. He's trying to figure out what's going on, and then it just never really happened. He looked like he was having a slow start. Then pretty soon, the slow start was a quick finish. It was, and so that's something that I would hope he will address. I know he's even talked about that and trying to get past that and be a little bit better from the get-go. And he's had some fights where he's done well right in the beginning, but it seems as though that slow start keeps dogging him. And when you're fighting these guys who are hungry, that could just eat you up.
His whole anywhere, anytime, whatever his thing is so cool in this day and age in one way, because he's really a fighter's fighter. Like he steps in there.
It's a little Tank Abbott-ish.
It is. Yeah. It's kind of crazy, but for him to maintain, like this was a weird one, like you were mentioning. Like normally when he goes through guys that are a little bit on the lower tier, he shows them that they belong on that tier, and he remains up here. This was a weird one because it was like a little bit more of a feeling of the baton being passed. Because if you remember, like guys like Miles Jury were on a streak, and he gave him a shot. They fought, and he beats Miles Jury. Right. Even like Alex, the other Cowboy, Oliveira, like guys like that, like who are coming up, and you're like, ooh, this is a big test. He handles it. You know what I mean? This is the first time where I felt like a guy on the come up. He's giving him that shot, which is always cool of him. That's the coolest part about him, is he doesn't really think about the consequences of something like this. He just signs it and fights. But here's the first time it really bit him.
Styles make fights. He has, as you mentioned, Jeff. He has. I don't know if I've ever seen him like come out of the gate roaring, but he withstood an onslaught from Melvin Gillard. Mm-hmm. He withstood an onslaught from Edson Barboza and wound up finishing him in a crazy fight. Even against Robbie Lawler. Remember, Lawler came out in that first round and was just bludgeoning him, and he found a way to slow the fight down.
Eddie Alvarez.
Yeah. And it took him a second. And then he still lost the Lawler fight, but he nevertheless, I think, put in a strong account of himself. Right. So you wonder, I asked like where he was in his career. My sense is, whatever perceptions we had of him as a title contender, whether how they were generous or not, I am fairly comfortable in saying I don't think he's ever really going to contend for a title short of some kind of miraculous circumstance. Mm-hmm. But I'm a little bit with Danny in the sense that I don't think he's over the hill either. He doesn't spar like he used to. He's still quite talented. Styles make fights, as I said before. If you can get the right matchup, this is not a sunset for him. But I do think it is a bit of a turning point. I think that's sort of the acknowledgement that we should have about him.
That's how this fight felt, 100%. Like, maybe he's not going to be able to continue to do this ridiculous thing that he's been doing for so long.
I mean, how many times the Edson Barboza fight probably, it wasn't the longest one, but it probably took some miles on, or if he had 9 lives like a cat, it probably took 2 or 3 of those. All right, so this brings us to somebody else who had a bit of a rough going, although did persevere. Bellator 185 was on Friday. I also watched this live because I'm a loser.
I watched it live.
Did you?
I watched it live.
Wow, 3 losers.
Yeah.
That's what this show should be called, 3 losers and Jeff.
Oh, no, I did watch it live, but I watched it in Espanol.
Okay. You know what? Those shouts to Manny and Jorge. Yeah. Those guys were great.
Diverse loser. All right.
Yes, I'm a diverse loser. I'm a loser in many ways. Okay, Gegard Mousasi, I'll be honest. I scored his fight for Alexander Shlemenko for Shlemenko. Now, I won't argue too much. It was obviously very close. Easy 3rd round for Shlemenko. Probably an easy 1st round for Gegard. That 2nd round, a little bit dicey, Jeff. So here's my point. He ends up winning the unanimous decision, and there's a lot of questions about what this means for Bellator, but I'll ask you this, and I know we've hinted at this before. I'm almost asking what your big takeaway is, but I more want you to focus on what does that result tell us? What's the big lesson we can take from that?
Well, what was the big what was the story from Gegard Mousasi coming in? He said, well, after I win this fight, then I'm going to go out and I'm going to win the title, and then I'm going to move up to light heavyweight.
They keep doing it, don't they?
He had this whole plan, like this.
Fight Rory, remember?
First, then Rory was going to be there too. So he was going to win he was going to win this fight, win the title, maybe get Rory in the middle of all that, then go up and get light heavyweight. He had the whole, thing, and in the beginning of the fight, I thought, geez, maybe this is going to happen, because if you remember the beginning of that fight, he was having his way. It just looked like it was a whole different level. in the beginning, I thought, and then it just sort of turned on him. And I think so. For me, the lesson is this is maybe the AAA version as opposed to the major leagues of the UFC, and maybe it's a little bit tiny step down in terms of the depth of competition. But on any given night, you need to focus on that guy across the cage. You can't be looking forward to the next one. And I think for Mousasi, I mean, look, he may come out and smoke the next guy he fights, but he's going to have to earn it.
I mean, his eyes almost closed, and you have to kind of look at that as it plays out through the whole thing. And he was on the MMA Hour, and I know he was saying it's basically going on instinct for a lot of that fight, and that's kind of a terrifying proposition. You know what I mean? So the fact that he was able to hang on and I don't know, maybe dupe the doctor a little bit and saying when they came in to check him and everything and get the win. I mean, you face different kinds of adversity. He was feeling a lot of pressure going into this situation. I know, having talked to him on Wednesday beforehand for a couple hours out at Mohegan Sun, he wasn't taking the fight lightly. Maybe that's how it's coming across, but it didn't.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that.
I know that he's still, in a long-term plan, he's thinking that he wants to do this, this, and this. But I felt like he was very focused on that block. You could tell there was some added pressure to perform because, going to Bellator, I think that it was mutual. Like, he thought he could bring them something, and I think he really wanted to perform in there. Terrifying proposition when your eye is shut in the first minute of that fight, and he's basically fighting on those instincts and was able to get it done. It was a coin flip to me in the end because of that second round. I could have seen it the exact way you're saying. In fact, I thought, for just a minute, when they were getting ready to read the scorecards, I was like, Shlemenko's going to win this fight, and Mousasi is going to be the next guy that fell in his debut. But fortunately for him, that didn't happen.
I scored it for Shlemenko as well. I scored that
2 rounds to 1.
Yeah, but it was a close one. I got into an argument with someone on Twitter, surprisingly.
Really, I've never had that problem.
Yeah,
ever.
right.
On Twitter?
Yeah, because I said it was a bad decision, but it wasn't a robbery, and they're like, well, how can it be a bad decision but not be a robbery? And I just told them, look,
that was you argued with someone about this? This is what the mute button is for.
I should start using it more often. But I'm like, look, just because every robbery is a bad decision, but not every bad decision is a robbery.
Correct.
And again, it was a very close fight. I know we mentioned how Bellator is maybe not as bad as we thought it was, but I really just think it was a bit of a freak accident. Before the eye was, all swollen up, he was doing just fine. Even when the eye was swelling up, you can tell he was in sort of an emergency state. And I felt like in the first round, he's like, I need to finish this, because he knew the eye was swelling up. And he was completely dominant in the first round. Right. But unfortunately, as you mentioned, Shlemenko doesn't have much neck and wasn't able to get a rear naked choke. But then he still went out in the second. I mean, just close your eye and imagine fighting another professional fighter with over 60 professional fights, former champ with one eye. I think, fans need to lay off Gegard. He did fantastic.
I think
considering the situation.
To me, this fight to me was like everything about the woes that Bellator has had. They've had some successes. Not to say they've been all woes. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, to the extent there have been woes, this fight was like the perfect encapsulation of it. And here's why. Number one, it was 3 rounds instead of 5. Now, they got off lucky with that. Right. But you ask yourself, if it had been 5 rounds, who would have won? Probably Shlemenko. Seems like a reasonable thing. But they don't do 5 rounds because they need to create room for the Vanderleys and the Chaels, and Tito's gone, but the Titos and the Bonners, because those guys, it would be a disaster if they had 5-round fights. Yeah. So now you don't really know who you are. Are you the kind of guy who signed, or are you the kind of promoter, who signs a Gegard Mousasi for 5-round fights, or are you the kind who has the 3-round? It was this identity crisis there. Plus, Mousasi coming over. Now, we didn't know this on Friday night, but it turned out after +3 DVR, meaning after 3 days, how many people checked it out on DVR, but the initial report of ratings was 476,000 watching on Friday night. That is nubs. Yeah. Wow, that is nubs. That is not good at all. So you had this moment, and they promoted it too. He was on Ariel's show. Yeah. Gegard was on my show. He was on 1,000 shows. They actually went and did the work. So to me, it was like you promoted it. People didn't necessarily tune in. Then you got by on the skin of your teeth, but it still raised these other issues about what is your product. Am I overstating this, Jeff?
Well, I think it's
you give me side eye over there.
Small sample size. I mean, look, the guy did go out there and win the fight. And actually, for the record, I did actually score it. I did score that second round for Mousasi. Okay. So I had a 2-1 for him. I was watching, as I said, the Spanish broadcast. I don't understand Spanish very much, so I was not being poisoned by the broadcast narrative. I mean, you watch whenever you watch the
Jimmy
fights.
and Mauro were good.
Yeah, and nothing against them or nothing against the UFC guys, but when you're watching a fight and they see the fight a certain way, you end up sort of seeing it that way, despite yourself. So I was, kind of just watching it on my own. I did not watch it a second time to check my scoring, but I definitely thought he did squeak that out. But look, I mean, I think you're right. There's definitely a lot more work to do to build this guy up. And look, even when he was the UFC, he was not the biggest charismatic guy who was going to draw a lot of eyeballs. He just was, he made his way by winning fights, and he won this fight. I know it was a tough one, but he won the fight.
Philosophically strange because they bring in guys like Gegard Mousasi, who obviously, he won like 5 in a row going into this, and all in the UFC. They bring in guys like Rory McDonald, who he'd lost a couple, but you knew he was still viable. He was going to bring something to the table. He was going to be competitive. And those guys are the types that you could do a 5 round. Like you were talking about the mentality of, are they the kind of guys who can fight 5 rounds? Are they the kind of guys that like that MSG card that they did was the prime example. You kind of had the mix, and that's where the identity is a little weird because you have Chael Sonnen in there fighting, but yet you had Pico on the card. He loses. You have Chandler, and he loses. It was
Heather Hardy on that same card,
exactly.
and Hulaton on that same card.
So it's like those types of things. It's like they're trying to do both, and they keep getting burnt on both sides too. And I feel like that's the way these cards are playing out. So this card had a little bit, it was like a microcosm of the whole, but MSG and a couple of those other cards have played out that way as well.
But you can look at it if you're looking in the glass half full here. Mousasi did go out and win the fight. And then you had Shlemenko, and I think last week on the show here we were talking about him and saying, well, the enduring image of him is getting beat up by Tito Ortiz and, a kind of over-the-hill Tito Ortiz. So that was a kind of a negative veneer around Shlemenko. Well, now I would say that even though he lost this fight, there's less negativity surrounding him. He fought and in a lot of people's eyes defeated a guy who was one of the top contenders in the UFC, and he comes over here, and this guy, gives him a great fight. Whether he won or lost, we can all argue about that, but he put out a really good fight. I think that his stock, in a sense, rises a little bit over what it was before.
Passed the drug test, that mattered too.
Yes. Let's move this along. We're running a little bit short on time. I want to make sure we get a couple more topics in. This one I thought was incredibly interesting. There is now, I won't say fever pitched, but there is a heightened level of discussion around the UFC potentially getting into boxing. UFC President Dana White was asked about that on a show this week. He did not deny that.
That was that podcast.
Something. I don't know.
The unnamed podcast.
Yeah, I think it's what it's called, right?
Yeah,
the unnamed podcast. Yeah, with Tweedledee and whoever the f. So long story short, he doesn't deny. He's like, yeah, down the road there could be something we want to do. He had the Zuffa boxing shirt on during the Mayweather-McGregor thing. I asked him about it, and I said, is this something you're interested in? He's like, I'm not interested. Okay. And then I missed this news when I was on vacation, but I saw it today, and my eyes got as big as saucers. Ari Emanuel approached Bob Arum, who is the head of Top Rank. And Top Rank and Bob Arum these are guys who literally, Bob Arum anyway, has promoted Muhammad Ali, for crying out loud, okay? I mean, we're a guy, and everyone takes a dump on Bob, but he's been around for a while, okay? They wanted to purchase the Top Rank library. Now, for what purpose? Fight Pass, presumably? I'm guessing. I'm not exactly sure. Ultimately, they went another direction. They signed with ESPN. So, Chuck, let's sort of put 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 and 2 together here. It does sound like this is something that they're kicking the tires on. Should they do it?
Man, so tough because I look at it from a fan's perspective and what is the ultimate goal of your company? And at some point you think, we argue about too many events. We argue about introducing new weight classes, what that would mean to things in general. And I always think to the accessibility of your sport, the identity of your sport. Well, UFC, we know what this is, but it's taken a long time to kind of get here. There's still people who are like, what is that, pro wrestling? They don't know what it is. Some casual people don't know what it is. The further you take it afield, the more you take on, the more you complicate it, depending on what they call it. I don't know what they would call it or how this works. I always see it from a problematic standpoint of like too much where it becomes more and more inaccessible to just anybody to even understand what is going on with your brand. And I feel like that's at some point, that's what bothers me about it. But money talks for these guys. Money talks. And this is one of those things you think like, Dana just had he's dealt with boxing his whole career really, but his beginnings are a lot with boxing and things like that. And he just went through this process with this whole Mayweather thing. And you think like, well, maybe he's just, in the perfume of it a little bit and it's not real. But I do worry about the accessibility at some point.
Well, you talk about the brand. When you think about mixed martial arts, the UFC is gold. It is the gold standard of mixed martial arts as a promotion. So now they veer over and jump into the boxing pool. Well, you've already got Oscar De La Hoya's promotion. You've already got, Mayweather. He's not going to fight anymore. You figure he's going to keep his promotional company going, and he's going to be a player. You've got the, I guess that's kind of related to the Showtime stuff. And you got, ESPN jumping in. There's a lot of other players in this who are far more established than you are, as in the boxing game at least. And so does the UFC want to be, the gold standard of MMA and the kind of, bronze standard or tinfoil standard of boxing? I mean, there's a lot to build there. I mean, I understand why they'd want to maybe get into some big fights and sign some fights, but I just can't imagine that they would be jumping in with both feet the same way they do MMA.
I mean, the UFC has something that the other, boxing promotions don't have, which is MMA fighters. We recently saw Paul Daly make his, not Paul Daly, Michael Page make his boxing debut. And I do believe there's an audience for that. And, we talk about like, we just want to see high level fighting and these guys are not boxers, they're MMA fighters. But, there are some MMA fighters that can do well and can compete against, a decent level fighters. And I think there's an audience for that. For example, I know we posted the news on Twitter and Ross Pearson immediately like quote tweeted and he's like, where do I sign? I think there is room for some guys to do that jump and perhaps, remain a little bit more active and compete in both sports. Artem Lobov has said he. I
mean, I'd honestly rather die than watch an Artem Lobov box.
I think there's room for it. Just keeping these guys a little bit more active, getting them another paycheck.
If you're going to be in the business to promote bad boxing, then you should not get in that business. It seems to me, Danny, what they really want to do, I could be wrong, they're looking at boxing right now, which is hot. Anthony Joshua fights this weekend. Deontay Wilder's going to fight coming up as well. There's a lot. I mean, there's the
hotter than it's been in a long time.
Yeah. The cruiserweight series that's not even on American television has been incredible, and there's a lot of other things that are going on at the same time. And of course, Lomachenko's going to be fighting on ESPN here. It's all kinds of stuff. It looks to me that they're saying to themselves, why are we not, Danny, why don't we just put on the biggest fights that are there rather than just the biggest MMA fights? And if you think about it, they don't control Glory, they don't control EBI, they don't control Polaris, but under Fight Pass, they give these organizations a budget to produce something. If they can just throw a production budget at somebody and put it on Fight Pass, why can't they do that with boxing? But it's really the biggest stuff, I think, is that they're going after, no? You disagree with that?
I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the UFC is looking for.
Nobody knows. We're speculating. That's what the show's about. This show. Speculate.
I would assume so. Obviously, the UFC's into making big business. I don't know if they'd be into, perhaps putting up, again, back to the Bellator thing, a Michael Page fight, sort of something of that level, of that stature, something that's not too big. So I would assume, they would want to make.
I think you got to go big. I mean, I think you named a bunch. You mentioned a bunch of names. You mentioned Joshua. You mentioned Lomachenko. You mentioned who was the other one? Wilder. You got to get somebody in that universe. If you're going to go into boxing, you're the UFC.
Paul Malignaggi, UFC boxer. What?
Okay, next. That's out of here.
Let's move on.
I can't talk about that.
Here's the only thing about that worries me just a slightly bit is like is if they actually had success. Which is to say, what would that mean for their prioritization of MMA? That would kind of concern me. And also, just like as a general consumer, we already maybe, people who live in different countries don't have the exact same experience. But here in the United States, you've got like 4 airlines at your local airport. You've got 2 telecommunications companies to pick who you want mobile service with. You've got a handful of, there's always just like a handful or less of choices in every consumer sector. I would like to see a little bit of that broken up. And so that would concern me about consumer choice. But I suppose that's a little bit esoteric.
You mentioned, like the metamorphosis and things like that. For some reason, we can individualize those sports, jiu-jitsu or say kickboxing, and an MMA person can look at that as a piecemeal part of their sport and broken them in. You're the one who's talking about boxing is not like that. For whatever reason, those two worlds, MMA and boxing, have remained at odds. And I thought we saw that, in strange ways during this whole Mayweather-McGregor thing. You finally got the medias together, and you could tell the differences of what was going on there. You could tell where one was coming from versus the other, and it was just a strange sort of thing. I still have I feel like boxing for MMA people sometimes can be like, hey, no thanks. You know what I mean? And so it's a little
And
different.
vice versa.
And vice versa. So it's like, it's a little different to have to contemplate boxing. It's kind of like, you know.
The thing is, in boxing, promoters work together. Everyone thinks it'd be the exact same UFC model. I think the UFC wants to get into it because I think they realized there are big boxers out there, but these companies like Top Rank, these companies like Golden Boy, they're big, but they don't have nearly, even a slimmed down version of the UFC, they don't have nearly the same internal services. They don't have a performance institute. They don't have nearly the same kind of
And
PR
you know
staff.
that probably boxers are in Zuffa's ear, basically saying the stuff. You know what I mean? Like, you know, behind the scenes, they're like, hey, we'd love to have that, you know?
And if it's going to be a cooling off period for MMA and a hot period for boxing, I don't think they want to miss that boat. So there's some things to think about here. Before we go very quickly, and we're going to be on MMAfighting.twitter.com after this, which I'll talk about in just a second. Very, very quickly, there is UFC Sao Paulo this weekend. Here we go. I'm going to spring this on you. Did you hear that sigh? Oh my God!
It's actually a pretty good card.
It's like I told him, proctology exam. Just let's get to work here. I'll start at that end of the table since you seem so enthusiastic.
Now you have to wait.
Yeah, now you have to wait. You have to sit on that thumb. Fight you're looking forward to most off that card?
I'm a little biased, but I'm gonna go with John Lineker versus Marlon Vera.
There you go. Chito.
Chito Era, yeah. I think that's a really good fight. Big, huge step up for Chito. And he's been a guy that's, you know, training in Ecuador, training among lawyers and guys who weren't even amateur. And now he's actually in a good camp. And, you know.
Colin Oyama.
Yeah, and he's been putting together a 3-fight win streak, a solid one. So I'm really curious, and he's only 24. He's a prospect. I'm really curious to see how he fares against him.
Also an English speaker, should be noted.
Same reason that Cerrone and Till was a fun fight. You got to look at Maya and Covington and think, like, here we go.
Of course.
You know what I mean, like those two guys, you get one guy who's already there and a guy who's trying to take his place. So those are always fun.
Yeah, that was actually Maya was the one that I always love to see Maya fight because he's Maya, because of what he can do, how he can do things that nobody else in the sport can do. And I mean, we can talk about other guys who are great at what they do, but Maya is, you know, he's just spectacular. And here's a guy who wants to beat the crap out of him. And, you know, that's.
And it's the return of Lyoto Machida. Lyoto Machida's been gone for 2 years on what can only be described as the world's most senseless and idiotic suspension ever.
Yeah, and Brunson's a tough guy.
Tough guy. Not a suspension that holds up to rational scrutiny at all.
And also Jim Miller's on the card.
Jim
Can't go
Miller's
wrong with
on the
Jim
card.
Miller.
Against Massaran Duba, two war horses, boy. It's going to be great. That'll be on Fox Sports 1. The prelim will be on Fox Sports 2, so mind that for you, those of you who have differing cable packages. Okay, so here's what we're going to do now. By the way, Danny, I called you the most average Colombian. I'm going to take that back. You're the world's most above-average Colombian. Wow. That's who you are.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Space of 1 hour, he went up. It's like it's like a belt ceremony.
People get so sensitive around here these days. All right, here's what we're going to do. This show is over for all intents and purposes, but we're going to go over right now live to Twitter. You can go to MMAfighting.twitter.com to join the conversation. Send your questions, comments, bitches, gripes, smart-ass remarks at the MMA Beat. We call it After the Beat. Well, it's not what I call it, but some people call it that anyway. It's the official title. But so do that now. We're going to end this, and then we'll see you over on Twitter. That is Danny, that is Chuck, that is Jeff, I am Luke. Join us now on Twitter for the second portion of whatever it is we're calling it. It's the, yes, see you there on Twitter. Bye.